Much has changed over the past 100 years. Where technology has improved our living standards, we find that our government has significantly changed from one of limited scope to that of pervasive intervention. 100 years ago, it was generally conceded that one extremely important function of government was to enforce contracts made voluntarily in the marketplace. Today, government notoriously interferes with almost every voluntary economic transaction. Consumerism, labor laws, wage standards, hiring and firing regulations, political correctness, affirmative action, the Americans with Disability Acts, the tax code, and others place a burden on the two parties struggling to transact business. The EPA, OSHA, and government-generated litigation also interferes with voluntary contracts. At times, it seems a miracle that our society adapts and continues to perform reasonably well in spite of the many bureaucratic dictates. As the 20th century comes to a close, we see a dramatic change from a government that once served an important function by emphasizing the value of voluntary contracts to one that excessively interferes with them. Although the interference is greater in economic associations than in social, the principle is the same. Already we see the political correctness movement interfering with social and religious associations. Data banks are set up to keep records on everyone, especially groups with strong religious views and anybody who would be so bold as to call himself a patriot. The notion that there is a difference between murder and murder driven by hate has established the principle of a thought crime, a dangerous trend indeed. When the business cycle turns down, all the regulations and laws that interfere with economic and personal transactions will not be as well tolerated, and then the true cost will become apparent. It is under the conditions of a weak economy that such government interference generates a reaction to the anger over the rules that have been suppressed. To the statist, the idea that average people can and should take care of themselves by making their own decisions and that they don't need Big Brother to protect them in everything they do is anathema to the way they think. The bureaucratic mindset is convinced that without the politician's effort, no one would be protected from anything, rejecting the idea of a free market economy out of ignorance or arrogance. This change in the 20th century has significantly contributed to the dependency of our poor on government handouts, the recipients being convinced they are entitled to help and that they are incapable of taking care of themselves. A serious loss of self-esteem and unhappiness results, even if the system on the short run seems to help them get by. There were no federal laws at the end of the 19th century dealing with drugs or guns. Gun violence was rare, and abuse of addictive substances was only a minor problem. Now, after 100 years of progressive government intervention in dealing with guns and drugs, with thousands of laws and regulations, we have more gun violence and a huge drug problem. Before the social authoritarians decided to reform the gun and drug culture, they amended the Constitution enacting alcohol prohibition. Prohibition failed to reduce alcohol usage, and a crime wave resulted. After 14 years, the American people demanded repeal of this social engineering amendment and got it. Prohibition prompted the production of poor quality alcohol with serious health consequences, while respect for the law was lost as it was flagrantly violated. At least at that time, the American people believed the Constitution had to be amended to prohibit the use of alcohol, something that is entirely ignored today in the federal government's effort to stop drug usage. In spite of the obvious failure of alcohol prohibition, the federal government, after its repeal, turned its sights on gun ownership and drug usage. The many federal anti-gun laws written since 1934, along with the constant threat of outright registration and confiscation, have put the FBI and the BATF at odds with millions of law-abiding citizens who believe the Constitution is explicit in granting the right of gun ownership to all nonviolent Americans. Our government pursued alcohol prohibition in the 1920s and confiscation of gold in the 1930s. So it's logical to conclude that our government is quite capable of confiscating all privately owned firearms. That has not yet occurred, but as we move into the next century, many in Washington advocate just that and would do it if they didn't think the American people would revolt, just as they did against alcohol prohibition. Throughout this century, there has been a move toward drug prohibition, starting with the Harrison Act of 1912. The first federal marijuana law was pushed through by FDR in 1938. But the real war on drugs has been fought with intensity for the past 30 years. Hundreds of billions of dollars have been spent, and not only is there no evidence of reduced drug usage, we have instead seen a tremendous increase. Many deaths have occurred from overdoses of street drugs, since there is no quality control or labeling. Crime as a consequence of drug prohibition has skyrocketed, and our prisons are overflowing. Many prisoners are nonviolent and should be treated as patients with addictions, not as criminals. Irrational, mandatory, minimal sentences have caused a great deal of harm. We have nonviolent drug offenders doing life sentences, and there is no room to incarcerate the rapists and murderers. With drugs and needles illegal, the unintended consequence of the spread of AIDS and hepatitis through dirty needles has put a greater burden on the taxpayer who are forced to care for the victims. This ridiculous system that offers a jail cell for a sick addict rather than treatment has pushed many a young girl into prostitution to pay for the drugs priced hundreds of times higher than they are worth. But the drug dealers love the system and dread a new approach. When we finally decide that drug prohibition has been no more successful than alcohol prohibition, the drug dealers will disappear. But the monster drug problem we have created is compounded by moves to tax citizens so government can hand out free needles to drug addicts who are breaking the law in hopes that there will be less spread of hepatitis and AIDS in order to reduce government health care costs. This proposal shows how bankrupt we are at coming to grips with this problem. And it seems we will never learn. Tobacco is about to be categorized as a drug and prohibition of sorts imposed. This will make the drug war seem small if we continue to expand the tobacco war. Talk about insane government policies of the 20th century. Tobacco policy wins the prize. First, we subsidize tobacco in response to demand by the special interests, knowing full well, even from the beginning, that tobacco had many negative health consequences. Then we spend taxpayers' money warning the people of its dangers without stopping the subsidies. Government then pays for the care of those who choose to smoke, despite the known dangers and warnings. But it does not stop there. The trial lawyers' lobby saw to it that the local government entities could sue tobacco companies for reimbursement of the excess costs that they were bearing in taking care of smoking related.
The proceeding was brought to you as the community service of this cable company.
For their own acts. If one smokes and gets sick, that's the problem of the one making the decision to smoke, or take any other risk for that matter, not the innocent taxpayer who have already been forced to pay for the tobacco subsidies and government health warning ads. Beneficiaries of this monstrous policy have been tobacco farmers, tobacco manufacturers, politicians, bureaucrats, smokers, health organizations, and physicians, and especially the trial lawyers. Who suffers? The innocent taxpayers that have no choice in the matter and who acted responsibly and chose not to smoke. Think of what it would mean if we followed the same logic and implemented a federal social program similar to the current war on smoking, designed to reduce the spread of AIDS within the gay community. Astoundingly, we have done the opposite by making AIDS a politically correct disease. There was certainly a different attitude 100 years ago regarding those with sexually transmitted diseases like syphilis compared to the special status given AIDS victims today. And it is said that an interventionist economy is needed to make society fair to everyone. We need no more government fairness campaigns. Egalitarianism never works and inevitably penalizes the innocent. Government in a free society is supposed to protect the innocent, encourage self-reliance, and impose equal justice while allowing everyone to benefit from their own effort and suffer the consequences of their own acts. A free and independent people need no authoritarian central government dictating eating, drinking, gambling, sexual, or smoking habits. When the rules are required, they should come from the government closest to home, as it once did prior to America's ill-fated 20th century experiment with alcohol prohibition. Let's hope we show more common sense in the 21st century in these matters than we did in the 20th. A compulsive attitude by politicians to regulate nonviolent behavior may be well-intentioned, but leads to many unintended consequences. Legislation passed in the second half of the 20th century dealing with drugs and personal habits has been the driving force behind the unconstitutional seizure and forfeiture laws and the loss of financial privacy. The war on drugs is the most important driving force behind the national police state. The excuse given for calling in the Army helicopters and tanks at the Waco disaster was that the authorities had evidence of an amphetamine lab on the Davidian property. This was never proven, but nevertheless it gave the legal cover, but not the proper constitutional authority, for escalating the attack on the Davidians, which led to the senseless killing of so many innocent people. The attitude surrounding this entire issue needs to change. We should never turn over the job of dealing with bad habits to our federal government. That is a recipe for disaster.